Dinner, I said. Can't wait for our annual reunion. My brother smirked. We voted. You're not invited, it's for true bloods only. My parents looked away. I just smiled and left. 3 days later, my dad tried to withdraw $15,000 to pay the resort. I sent a screenshot. Transfer denied. True bloods can pay their own bills. Hours later, my doorbell rang repeatedly. The smell of Sunday roast used to mean I was home. Now it just means my jaw tightens before I even walk through the door. There is a particular kind of dread that only builds up over decades, layer by layer, until it becomes indistinguishable from the smell of a specific meal, and I've never quite managed to separate the two since. I am 32 years old. I own and run Corvid Analytics, a data infrastructure company that helps mid-size logistics and retail chains predict inventory failures before they happen. We have 81 employees, offices in 2 cities, and a client roster that includes 3 companies most people would recognize from their grocery receipts. I built this company out of a laptop and a folding table in a studio apartment that smelled permanently of instant noodles. None of that mattered, sitting at my adoptive parents' dining table that Sunday, because in that room I was still 11 years old, still the boy who'd arrived with 1 duffel bag and a court order. I want to note, before going further, the strange split-screen quality of sitting in that dining room at 32 while simultaneously feeling 11. I had, by any external measure, more power in that room than anyone else present, more money, more legal standing, a business that could have bought and sold Desmond's failing manufacturing company several times over, and none of it mattered, not for one single second, once Rhett's fork hit the table with that small, precise click. Status doesn't travel cleanly across a threshold like that. You can walk into a childhood house as a titan of industry, and walk out of it 20 minutes later, exactly as small as you were the first time someone in that house taught you exactly how small you were allowed to be. I want to describe that arrival, briefly, because it shapes everything that came after it. I remember the specific texture of the duffel bag's canvas strap digging into my shoulder. The smell of the Okafor Wren house on that first evening, lemon polish and something floral I couldn't identify. So different from the smell of my own house, that it felt less like entering a new home than entering a museum I wasn't allowed to touch anything in. Priscilla had shown me to a guest room that would, over the following months, slowly and grudgingly become my room, though it never fully lost the quality of a space I was borrowing rather than one that belonged to me. Desmond had shaken my hand that first night, an oddly formal gesture for an 11-year-old, and told me that he expected me to be no trouble, a phrase I turned over in my head for years afterward, wondering exactly how much trouble a grieving child was allowed to be before he stopped being worth keeping. At the head of the table sat my adoptive father, Desmond Okafor Wren, the hyphenated name, a relic of a merger between 2 prominent local families 2 generations back, a name he wore like a medal. Beside him, my adoptive mother Priscilla, cutting her chicken into smaller and smaller pieces without eating any of it, the way she always did when she was bracing for something. Across from me was my younger brother by 2 years, Rhett, the biological son, golden in every literal and metaphorical sense, sun-streaked hair, a permanent tan from age, life that had never once required him to work weekends, and a smirk he'd been perfecting since he was old enough to understand it worked on our parents like a skeleton key. Beside Rhett sat our sister Blythe and her fiancé Anders, a man who'd once told me unprompted that his family's ski chalet had actual history to it, as though mine had been assembled from a kit. I was trying to keep the conversation moving, the way I always did, building a small rickety bridge across a silence that had existed in that house long before I arrived and would exist long after I stopped trying to cross it. I picked up a new telescope for the reunion, I said, aiming the comment at Rhett, who'd once, as kids, dragged a beat-up refractor telescope out to the dock every August to look at the Perseids. Figured we could finally get a clean look at the meteor shower this year, if the weather holds. The reunion. Ashcombe Lake. A week at the family's old lodge that 4 generations of Okafor Wrens had gathered at every August without fail. I'd been going since I was 11, carrying a backpack too big for me, always half a step behind the cousins who'd known each other since birth. I want to describe what that lake actually meant to me, because I think without it, the cruelty of Rhett's announcement doesn't land with its full weight. Ashcombe Lake had been, for 21 years, the one place where the rigid hierarchy of the house seemed to loosen slightly, if only because there was more space to spread out into, more cousins to blend among, more activity to fill the hours that might otherwise have been spent under Desmond's direct scrutiny. I'd learned to fish there, badly at first, from a great uncle who was patient, in a way none of my adoptive parents ever quite managed to be. I'd had my first kiss on that dock, at 15, with a second cousin's friend who was visiting for the week, and who I never saw again. I'd spent a week there, the summer after my birth parents' first anniversary of passing, quietly grieving in a canoe in the middle of the lake because it was the only place in my entire world, that year, where nobody expected anything of me at all. The lake wasn't just a vacation. It was the closest thing I had to a memory of unconditional belonging, however illusory that belonging might have actually been. Losing it wasn't losing a week of scenery. It was losing the one remaining place where I'd allowed myself to believe, at least partially, that I was actually wanted, rather than merely tolerated. Rhett set his fork down with a small, precise click. "You're not coming this year." The room went quiet, in the specific way a room goes quiet, when everyone already knows what's about to be said, except the one person it's being said to. "What?" "We had a family meeting about it," Rhett said, leaning back, arms crossed, the posture of a man delivering a verdict rather than news. "Space is tight this year. Anders's parents are coming, some investors of his too. We decided it should just be blood this year. Keep it clean." I want to describe the exact quality of my own confusion in that moment, because it's easy, retelling this now, to make it sound like I understood immediately what was happening. I didn't. My first instinct wasn't hurt. It was genuine, almost clinical confusion, the kind you feel when a system you've relied on for years suddenly behaves in a way that violates every assumption you'd built your understanding of it on. I had spent 21 years operating under the assumption that my place in that family, however strained, however conditional, was at minimum stable enough that a group decision like this would have required my presence, or at least my knowledge, before being finalized. The realization that it hadn't, that an entire meeting had been convened, discussed, and resolved, without anyone considering it necessary to include me even as a courtesy, took a beat longer to land than the actual sentence itself. Blood this year. 2 words, and 21 years of Sunday dinners, birthday cakes, and driving lessons folded up small enough to fit in a coat pocket and be thrown away. I looked at Desmond. Surely he'd correct this. Surely 21 years bought me at least that much. Desmond kept his eyes on his plate, cutting his chicken with more focus than chicken has ever required. Priscilla stared at her water glass. Blythe wasn't looking away. She was looking straight at me, nodding faintly along with her brother, and Anders wore the smallest, smuggest smile I'd ever wanted to slap off a grown man's face. They'd voted, without me, in the room, on whether I still counted. I sat there for a moment longer than I probably should have, turning the word vote over in my head, trying to picture the actual meeting. When had it happened? Who had called it? Had anyone at that table paused, even for a second, to argue in my favor before the motion carried? I thought about all the Sunday dinners I'd shown up to over the years, even when I was exhausted from an 80-hour work week. All the birthdays I'd flown back for, all the small, unglamorous acts of loyalty that had never once been reciprocated with anything beyond tolerance. And I understood, sitting there, that none of it had ever been weighed in whatever calculation produced that vote. My presence had simply never been counted as an asset in the first place. Only my money had. I want to note, too, the specific detail of Rhett's phrasing. Keep it clean. Not, we thought it would be nice to have a smaller group this year. Not any of the softer euphemisms available to him. Clean implied that my presence was, by contrast, a kind of contamination. Something that needed to be filtered out before the gathering could achieve whatever purity he imagined it deserved. I've turned that word choice over more times than any other single detail from that dinner, because I think, more than the vote itself, it was the moment I understood exactly how my brother had come to think of me over the years. Not as family who happened to be inconvenient, but as an impurity to be managed. I did not raise my voice. I did not cry. 21 years in that house had taught me exactly how to build a wall out of ice, in under 4 seconds. I folded my napkin, set it beside my plate, and stood. Understood, I said, my voice level. Enjoy the lake. I walked out. I did not slam the door. I want to note that detail specifically, because I think it mattered more than anything I said inside that room. A slammed door would have given them a story to tell afterward. That I'd overreacted, that I'd always been the volatile one, that my exclusion had simply been proven correct by my own behavior. A quiet door gave them nothing. It just left the silence exactly where they'd built it, with nobody left in the room to blame for it but themselves. Sitting in my car afterward, engine off, hands white on the wheel, my mind did the thing minds do after a fresh wound. It went looking for the old ones, the ones you'd told yourself were healed, to see if they matched. I was 11 when my birth parents died in a house fire in a rural town 2 hours from here. No surviving relatives, close enough or willing enough to take me. The Okafor Wrens, family friends of my late mother, took me in with a great deal of public fanfare. The local paper ran a small feature on their generous, big-hearted family. Behind that closed door, the generosity had an asterisk. I want to include one memory from that very first year, because it's the earliest evidence I have of the pattern that would eventually define the entire relationship. About 4 months after I moved in, my 5th grade teacher, a soft-spoken woman named Mrs. Abernathy, asked to meet with Priscilla and Desmond after. Noticing that I flinched whenever another student raised their hand quickly near me, and that I ate lunch alone even when other children invited me to join them, she suggested, gently, that some form of grief counseling might help me adjust. I wasn't in the room for that meeting, but I overheard, weeks later, Desmond complaining to a business associate on the phone that the school was making a big production out of nothing, that grief counseling was expensive nonsense for a boy who just needed structure and discipline. I never saw a counselor. I did, however, notice that the structure and discipline arrived promptly, in the form of a chore chart with my name on considerably more line items than Rhett's, a small concrete illustration of exactly what adjustment was going to mean in that house. I want to describe the specific texture of that first year, because I think it's easy, telling this story in retrospect, to make the cruelty sound consistent from the very beginning, when in truth it arrived gradually, in small doses that were each individually easy to explain away. Priscilla was, in that first year, genuinely gentle with me in certain moments. She'd sit with me some evenings while I did homework, ask about my day, seem to actually want to know the answer. It was only over the following years, as Rhett grew older and began to actively compete for the same finite pool of attention I'd been quietly, gratefully receiving, that the gentleness began to narrow, redirect, and eventually disappear from my direction almost entirely. I've spent a long time since wondering whether that early gentleness was ever genuine, or whether it was simply easier to perform when I was young enough not to represent any real competition yet. I don't think I'll ever know the answer, and I've made a kind of peace with not knowing. I remember being 13, having spent 6 weeks building a scale model bridge for a school engineering competition. Balsa wood, fishing line, a design I'd worked out over 3 notebooks of failed sketches. I left it on the garage workbench to let the glue cure overnight. In the morning, it was in pieces on the floor. Rhett was in the kitchen eating cereal, a hockey stick propped against his chair. Was practicing my slap shot, he said, not even bothering to fully commit to the lie. It got in the way. I ran to Desmond, holding pieces of my project, and he looked at the wreckage and then at me with real anger, not at Rhett, at me for leaving clutter in a shared space. I was grounded for a week. Rhett finished his cereal. I want to add one detail to that memory that I've never told anyone outside of Ose's office, because it's the part that actually broke something in me, more than the grounding itself. That evening, alone in my room, I overheard Desmond and Priscilla talking in the hallway, their voices not quite low enough. Priscilla asked, gently, whether they should maybe talk to Rhett about the bridge, whether it seemed intentional. Desmond's response has stayed with me for 19 years. It's just a school project, Priscilla. Let it go. The boy needs to learn resilience somewhere, might as well be here. The boy, not our son, not even Mama. Just a designation, a category. A problem to be managed, rather than a child to be protected. I understood at 13, without fully having the language for it yet, that I existed in that house under a different classification than Rhett did, and that classification came with a permanently lower ceiling on how much protection I was entitled to. I was 18 the year I got into 2 state honors programs, and one out-of-state engineering school, with a partial scholarship. Desmond sat me down in his study, steepled his fingers, and explained, with the tone of a man delivering unfortunate quarterly earnings, that Rhett's tuition at a private business college was already consuming the family's education budget, and that it would build character for me to attend community college locally and work my way up. Rhett, at the time, had a 2.1 gigapascals and a car Desmond had bought him outright the same month. I did exactly what I was told. I worked 3 jobs through 2 years of community college, transferred, finished my degree with debt I paid off at 29, and told myself the whole time that if I just worked hard enough, they'd finally see me as theirs. I want to describe one more memory before moving past those years, because it's the one that, looking back, taught me the actual mechanics of how the house worked. Not just that I was treated differently, but the specific method by which that difference got laundered into something that always, somehow, ended up being my fault. I was 16, and I'd saved $400 from a summer of mowing lawns and stocking shelves at a hardware store. Money I was putting toward a used car so I could stop taking the 2-bus route to my part-time job. I kept the cash in an envelope in my sock drawer, a hiding spot that felt, at 16, cleverer than it actually was. Priscilla found it while doing laundry. And that evening, over dinner, she informed me, gently, almost sweetly, that Rhett needed the money for a school ski trip that Desmond had already told him he couldn't afford that month. "You'll get it back," she said, not quite meeting my eyes. "Think of it as a loan. Family helps family." I never saw that $400 again. Rhett went on the ski trip. When I asked about it, weeks later, Priscilla told me I was being petty over a little money, and that I should be grateful I even had a family willing to share resources with me at all, as though the resources in question hadn't been mine to begin with, earned by my own hands, taken without my consent, and never returned. I think about that $400 more than almost anything else from that house, more even than the balsa wood bridge, because it was the first time I understood, with total clarity, that in that house, what was mine was simply theirs, whenever they decided they needed it, and what was theirs remained entirely, permanently theirs. The asymmetry wasn't accidental. It was the entire operating system of the family, and I had simply been too young, for too long, to see it as anything other than the ordinary weather of my life. There's one more memory I want to include here, from the summer I turned 20, because it's the one that finally taught me the actual outer limit of what that family was willing to do to protect its own comfort. I'd been accepted into a summer research fellowship at a university 2 states away, a genuinely rare opportunity, fully funded, the kind of thing that would have looked extraordinary on any resume. The only catch was a $400 deposit to hold the spot, due within 2 weeks, which I'd saved from a part-time job stacking shelves at a hardware store on weekends. I kept the cash in an envelope taped beneath a drawer in my desk, a habit I'd developed years earlier, after the ski trip incident, though I never fully admitted to myself why I'd started hiding money from my own family. 10 days before the deposit was due, Rhett came to me, uncharacteristically humble, explaining that he needed exactly $350 to secure a spot at a leadership retreat for aspiring entrepreneurs, a program that, when I later looked it up, turned out to be a glorified networking weekend with a business casual dress code and an entry fee wildly disproportionate to anything it actually offered. I told him, calmly, that the money wasn't available, that it was earmarked for my own deposit, and that it wasn't up for negotiation this time. He didn't argue. He simply told Priscilla, who came to my room that evening and, without raising her voice, informed me that she supposed Rhett would just have to miss his opportunity, since I clearly wasn't willing to help my own brother, and that she hoped I'd be able to live with that. I held out for 4 days. On the 5th, I came home to find the envelope gone from beneath the drawer, the tape peeled back cleanly, no note, no acknowledgement that anything unusual had happened at all. When I asked Priscilla about it, she told me, without looking up from what she was doing, that she'd borrowed it for Rhett's retreat, that she'd pay me back before my deposit deadline, and that I shouldn't make such a fuss over something so temporary. She did not pay me back, in time. I missed the fellowship. I wrote the university a stiff, humiliated email about a family emergency, because I didn't yet have the language, at 20, to write the truer sentence. That my mother had simply decided my already earned opportunity mattered less than my brother's want, and had taken the money to prove it. There's a final memory from those years I want to include, from my early 20s, because it's the one that finally taught me something about Desmond specifically, separate from Priscilla's quieter, more passive complicity. I'd graduated college by then, was working my first real job, and had, for the first time, real disposable income. Not much, but enough that I'd finally started building a small savings account of my own, the beginning of what would eventually become the seed capital for Corvid. Desmond called me one evening, his voice warm, in a way it rarely was, inviting me to dinner. Just the two of us. A phrase that should have set off alarms given the family's history, but that I, still hungry for exactly this kind of individual attention, accepted eagerly. We went to a modest restaurant, nothing extravagant, and for the first 20 minutes he actually asked about my job, my apartment, my life, with what felt like genuine curiosity, the first sustained conversation of that kind we'd had in years. Then, over dessert, he explained that he was in a difficult spot with a business partner, that he needed a short-term personal loan of $4,000, just for 2 weeks, and that he'd chosen to ask me specifically because I was, in his words, the responsible one, the one who actually understands how money works. I remember the specific warmth that phrase produced in me at the time, the responsible one, a compliment so rare from him that I would have handed over considerably more than $4,000 simply to keep hearing it. I wrote the check that night. The money was never repaid within 2 weeks. It took, in the end, closer to 8 months. And only after I finally worked up the nerve to mention it, awkwardly, at another dinner. Desmond acted almost offended that I'd brought it up at all, as though tracking a debt between family members were itself a kind of betrayal, and paid me back in cash a few days later, in an envelope, without ever mentioning it again. I understand now, with the clarity of everything that came after, exactly what that dinner had actually been, a controlled experiment, testing whether flattery specifically tailored to my deepest insecurity, the fear of being merely useful rather than genuinely valued, could reliably unlock my wallet even without the more forceful tactics he'd need for larger asks later. It worked. It would keep working, in various forms, for another decade. I want to add one final observation about that particular dinner, because it took me years to fully see it. I remember driving home that night with $4,000 less in my account, feeling genuinely happy, not resentful, not used, simply happy, glowing almost from the rare experience of my father seeking me out specifically, treating me as capable, useful, worth confiding in. It took me a long time to understand that this happiness was itself the mechanism of the exploitation, not a side effect of it. He hadn't needed to threaten me or guilt-trip me that night, because he'd found something far more efficient, making the extraction feel, in the moment, like being chosen. I've thought since that this was, in its way, the cruelest of all his tactics, precisely because it worked by giving me something real to feel grateful for, rather than something to merely fear. Sitting in that car outside the house that night, the word blood still ringing in my ears, I understood fully for the first time that no amount of success was ever going to buy me a permanent seat at that table. I had been trying to purchase belonging with achievement for 21 years, and the currency had never once been accepted. I drove home to my apartment, not a lavish penthouse, just a clean 2-bedroom above a bakery that I genuinely loved, close enough to the office that I could walk in on weekends. Without thinking twice, and instead of pouring a drink, I did the thing that has always calmed me down since I was a kid building bridges out of balsa wood. I opened a spreadsheet. I keep, and have kept for years, an honest accounting of every dollar I've quietly funneled toward the Okafor Wrens, mostly because my business partner and closest friend Eden made me start tracking it years ago. So you at least know what you're bleeding, even if you won't stop the wound. I want to say something about Idun here, because she's been a constant presence in every version of this story I've told myself, and it's worth explaining why. We met in our second year at community college, both of us working part-time to cover tuition, both of us building small side projects late at night, out of a shared conviction that we were meant for something bigger than the jobs we were currently working. She was the one who convinced me, 6 years into my first job as a mid-level data analyst, that the inventory prediction model I'd built as a personal side project was actually a viable product, and she was the one who quit her own stable position to co-found Corvid with me on nothing but savings and conviction. She has never once, in 14 years of friendship, asked me for anything I wasn't already glad to give, and the contrast between that and everything I'd absorbed from the Okaforens had for years been a quiet, background hum I'd never fully let myself examine. "You keep saying you'll stop after this one," she told me once, years earlier, after I'd mentioned covering another one of Rhett's temporary expenses. "You've said that about 4 separate last times since I've known you." "It's different this time," I'd told her. The same thing I always told her. "It's never different," she'd said. "It's the same thing wearing a new hat, you know that, right?" I hadn't wanted to hear it then. Sitting at my kitchen table that night with the spreadsheet open, I finally did. Rhett's first business, a boutique cold brew company, ate through $40,000 of Desmond's savings before it opened. Then another $22,000 of mine when Desmond claimed his cash was temporarily tied up. It closed in 5 months. His second venture, an app that let people rate parking spots, cost me $18,000 more. Neither loan was ever discussed as a loan by Rhett. He referred to both, cheerfully, as family investing in family. I want to describe the cold brew failure in a bit more detail, because it's the one that first taught me exactly how the money would keep disappearing for years afterward. Rhett had never worked a single day in food service before deciding, at 24, that he understood the coffee business better than people who'd spent decades in it. He spent nearly a third of the initial budget on custom-branded aprons, a logo redesign he commissioned twice, and a launch party with an open bar for 80 guests, 3 weeks before he'd secured a single wholesale account. When the whole thing folded, he described it, without any apparent irony, as a valuable learning experience, the same phrase he'd use again 18 months later for the parking app, and again, I suspected, would use for whatever came next, because failure for Rhett had never once carried any actual cost. I had simply always been the one who absorbed it. Then there was Priscilla's back surgery 2 years ago, not fully covered by their insurance's out-of-network limits, quietly handled by a wire transfer I set up and never mentioned, $1,200 a month for 18 months. I want to describe how that particular arrangement started, because it's a good illustration of how the family's requests always arrived, wrapped in language designed to make refusal feel monstrous. Priscilla hadn't asked me directly. She'd mentioned, at a Sunday dinner much like the one that would eventually end everything, almost offhand, that the specialist Desmond's insurance covered had a 6-month waiting list, and that the out-of-network surgeon who could see her within 2 weeks wasn't covered, and that she supposed she'd just have to live with the pain until the waiting list came through. I offered to help before she'd ever asked, the way I always did, and she accepted with a small grateful smile that I mistook, at the time, for genuine warmth, rather than what I later came to understand it actually was, the practiced, comfortable gratitude of someone who had learned, over many years, exactly how to receive without ever quite having to ask. And then the largest one, 18 months ago, Desmond's manufacturing supply business, the one that funded the family's comfortable life, nearly collapsed when a major client left for a cheaper overseas vendor. He took me to an expensive dinner, cried into his wine, and told me I was the only one who could save the family name. I wrote him a bridge loan of $90,000, secured with a signed promissory note, quarterly payments due. I had received exactly 1 payment. I remember that dinner in specific, uncomfortable detail. The way Desmond had chosen the most expensive restaurant in the city, the way he'd ordered a bottle of wine that cost more than my rent, and the way, halfway through his tears, I'd caught him checking his phone, texting someone, apparently unable to fully commit even to the performance of vulnerability he was putting on for my benefit. I signed the promissory note anyway. I told myself, driving home that night, that this was different, that saving the business meant saving something real, not just funding another one of Rhett's whims. I understand now that I was simply finding a new, more dignified vocabulary for the same old transaction. The amount had just gotten larger as I had. The total at the bottom of the spreadsheet, $211,000, funneled quietly into a family that had just voted, unanimously and without my knowledge, that I wasn't blood enough to sit at their lake house. I want to describe what it actually felt like, sitting with that final number, because I think the number itself was less devastating than what it represented once I finally let myself see the shape of it clearly. $211,000. Spread across 7 years, wasn't a single catastrophic mistake. It was hundreds of small, individually reasonable-seeming decisions, each one justified in the moment by some specific, sympathetic circumstance. A surgery, a struggling business, a brother who just needed one more chance. No single decision, examined in isolation, looked unreasonable. It was only in aggregate, laid out on a single page with a single total at the bottom, that the pattern revealed itself for what it actually was, not generosity, but a slow, patient siphon that had operated for years precisely because it never asked for enough at any one moment to trigger real scrutiny. I thought, staring at that number, about a conversation I'd had with Idun years earlier, back when Corvid was still just an idea sketched out on napkins in her old apartment. I'd told her, half joking, that I sometimes felt less like a person to my family, and more like a well-managed asset. Reliable, undervalued relative to its actual output, and quietly, continuously drawn against. She hadn't laughed. She'd told me, seriously, that if I ever actually ran the numbers, I'd probably be horrified by how literally true that metaphor was. I hadn't run the numbers back then. I hadn't wanted to know. Sitting at my kitchen table that night, 7 years later, I finally did. And she'd been exactly right. My phone buzzed. Not an apology. A text from Desmond. The lodge deposit is due tomorrow morning. $12,000 to hold the week. Wire it tonight so I can confirm first thing. We'll sort out the dinner thing later. I read it twice. Then I laughed, short and humorless. The laugh of a man realizing he'd been living inside a very expensive delusion. He wanted me to bankroll the very trip I'd just been formally excluded from. I did not respond immediately. I opened my banking app, started the wire transfer, got as far as the confirmation screen, and stopped. Instead, my phone rang. A local number, unfamiliar. I want to describe that pause before the confirmation screen, because it's a moment I've returned to often since. I remember my thumb actually hovering over the button, remember the specific, exhausted calculation running through my head, that $15,000 was a small enough sum to simply absorb, that paying it might buy a few weeks of quiet, that the alternative, whatever it turned out to be, would certainly cost more in energy, even if it cost less in money. It was the same calculation I'd run 100 times over 21 years, the one that had always, eventually, ended in a wire transfer. I don't know, honestly, whether I would have completed that transfer if the phone hadn't rung at that exact moment. I've wondered about it since, in quieter moments, whether Wendell's call was the actual turning point of this entire story, or whether it simply interrupted a surrender that was already halfway complete. Is this Marlon? Marlon Ashwood from Corvid Analytics? The voice was strained, apologetic, in the specific way people sound when they're about to do something they know is wrong. Speaking. It's Wendell Farrow, from Farrow Component Supply. We've done business for 3 years. You know I hate to make this call. He exhaled. I've got to put a hold on your hardware shipments starting Monday. My stomach dropped. Farrow's components were critical to 2 of our field sensor contracts. Wendell, we have a signed agreement. You can't pause without 90 days written notice. What's going on? It's Desmond, he said, miserable. He called me an hour ago. Said you were acting erratically, refusing your family obligations, and that if I valued my standing with the Manufacturing Association in this city, I'd squeeze your supply line until you remembered your responsibilities. The blood drained from my face. Desmond hadn't just asked for money. He'd tried to sabotage my company to force my hand, before I'd even said no. I want to explain briefly why Wendell's call carried the particular weight it did. Wendell wasn't some faceless vendor. His father and Desmond had golfed together for 2 decades, and Wendell himself had actually attended a handful of our family's smaller gatherings over the years. Back when I was still naive enough to think that overlap meant something like genuine goodwill toward me specifically, rather than toward Desmond's social circle in general. Hearing him explain, apologetically, that Desmond had leveraged that decades-long relationship as a weapon against me, confirmed something I'd been circling for years without quite landing on, that my father's entire social world existed, in some fundamental sense, to be deployed whenever it might serve him, and I had simply never before been positioned as the target of that deployment, rather than an occasional beneficiary of it. Wendell, I said, keeping my voice level through sheer force of will, if you breach our contract because of a personal favor for a man who has no legal standing over my business, I will bury Farrow Supply in litigation you cannot afford. Tell Desmond exactly that. Marlon, Wendell stumbled, catching himself mid-sentence, the discomfort audible even through the phone. I don't want any part of whatever's going on with your family, I really don't. But he made it clear this wasn't optional if I wanted to keep doing business with anyone else he knows in this city. Then you have a decision to make about which threat is actually more expensive, I said. Because mine comes with a signed contract and a legal team on retainer. His comes with golf course gossip. I hung up. This wasn't cruelty born of ignorance anymore. This was a man willing to torch my company, a company I'd built with my own hands from nothing, to protect his own social standing. He didn't see me as a son. He saw me as an asset, with an inconvenient sense of dignity. I sat with the phone in my hand for a long moment after that call, in the quiet of my apartment, running through the sheer scale of what Desmond had just attempted. I thought about all the times over the years I'd made excuses for him, told myself he was simply a man of his generation, uncomfortable expressing affection, someone whose love just looked different than other fathers. I had built an entire cathedral of rationalizations to house that man's behavior, brick by brick, year by year, and Wendell's phone call had just knocked the whole structure down in under 90 seconds. There was no interpretation of squeeze his supply line until he remembers his responsibilities that landed anywhere close to fatherly discomfort. It was simply, plainly, an attempt to use my own livelihood as a lever against me, deployed by a man who had never once, in 21 years, hesitated to treat my success as a resource he was entitled to draw on. I want to describe one more thing about that call before moving forward, because it clarified something I hadn't fully articulated to myself until that exact moment. I realized, sitting there with the dead phone line still in my hand, that Desmond's threat hadn't actually been about the $15,000 at all. $15,000 was, for a man of my income, a genuinely trivial sum. I could have wired it without noticing the dent. What Desmond was actually testing, with that call to Wendell, was whether I would still bend to pressure the moment real pressure was applied, regardless of the dollar amount attached to it. It wasn't a financial transaction. It was a loyalty test disguised as one, designed to re-establish, quickly and forcefully, exactly which one of us still held the power in the relationship. He needed to know I'd still fold. The money was almost beside the point. I called Idun before I did anything else, mostly because I needed to say the facts out loud to someone before I trusted myself to act on them. He called your supplier, she repeated when I finished, her voice flat with a kind of disbelief that somehow made the whole thing feel more real rather than less. He tried to sabotage your actual company. Over $15,000 he didn't even need that badly for a trip you weren't invited to. That's the summary, yes, I said. Marlon, she said after a pause. I need you to hear this clearly, because I don't think you're going to want to hear it, and I think you need to anyway. This isn't a family being difficult anymore. This is a man attempting to commit an actual crime against your business, because you finally, for the first time in your entire life, told him, no. I love you, and I've watched you make excuses for this family for 14 years, and I am telling you, as your friend, and as someone who has personally lost sleep over how you're treated by them, this is the night. This is the actual night you stop. I didn't argue with her. I think some part of me had already arrived at the same conclusion on my own, sitting there with the phone in my hand, but hearing her say it plainly, without hedging, without the softening I might have offered myself, made it feel real in a way my own internal reasoning hadn't quite managed yet. I texted back a single line, attaching a screenshot of his demand. Transfer denied. Blood can fund its own vacations. I didn't sleep. By 7 the next morning, I'd called Idun and our general counsel, Priyasha, into the office. I remember making the coffee myself before either of them arrived, standing alone in the kitchen at 6 in the morning, watching the sun come up over a city that had no idea what had happened in my family the night before, and feeling, for the first time in longer than I could remember, that I was finally about to do something rather than simply endure something. You look like you're about to declare war on a small country, Idun said, setting down 2 coffees. Close enough, I said, and told them everything, the dinner, the vote, the text, Wendell's call. I want to say a brief word about Priyasha here, because her presence in this story matters beyond her legal function. I'd hired her 2 years earlier, initially just to handle Corvid's standard commercial contracts, but she'd stayed on as our general counsel specifically because of a quality Idun once described as allergic to letting people get away with things. Priyasha had grown up the eldest daughter in a large, demanding, extended family herself, and though she rarely talked about it directly, she'd mentioned once, in passing, that she understood something about the particular exhaustion of being the responsible one in a family that never quite recognized responsibility as a form of love worth reciprocating. I think that shared, unspoken understanding was part of why she took my case as personally as she did. Priyasha's eyes sharpened at the mention of the supply threat. That's attempted tortious interference, potentially extortion depending on wording. And the promissory note? Ironclad, I said. 90,003 missed quarterly payments. Acceleration clause triggers full repayment on default. Then we don't ask, Priyasha said. We demand, formally, today. Idun, meanwhile, had been quietly running public filings on Desmond's supply business while we talked. Marlon, you need to see this. Her screen showed a balance sheet soaked in red. He's leveraged everything, the house, the equipment, his cars. And he took out a short-term loan from a secondary lender 3 months ago. Balloon payment of $400,000 due at the end of next month. The timeline hit me like ice water. The reunion was scheduled for exactly that week. He was going to isolate me from the family, let the humiliation simmer, and then, on the last day, in front of the whole extended family, break down and beg me for a bailout too large to refuse in public. They hadn't just excluded me from a vacation. They'd built a trap, and the 90,000 was only the appetizer. I want to describe the rest of that morning in some detail, because the three of us spent nearly 2 hours mapping out exactly what Desmond's plan must have looked like from his side, and the exercise clarified something for me that I hadn't fully let myself see until that whiteboard was covered in it. Walk me through his logic, Priyasha said, tapping her pen against the table. He excludes you from the trip, publicly, in front of the whole family, which humiliates you and from his perspective teaches you a lesson about your place. Then he lets that sit for a few weeks. Meanwhile, he's also quietly trying to squeeze $15,000 out of you for the deposit, testing whether the humiliation actually broke your compliance or just your feelings. And when the $15,000 didn't work, Idun continued, he escalates to actual sabotage, because in his mind, you're not a person with boundaries. You're a resource that's temporarily malfunctioning, and malfunctioning resources get fixed with pressure. Then the reunion itself, I said, seeing it fully now, is the actual stage. He gets everyone together, the whole extended family, all the people whose opinion he actually cares about, and on the last night, in front of all of them, he breaks down, tells everyone the business is failing, that he's about to lose everything, that he needs help. And either I'm there, humiliated back into the fold specifically to be asked, or I'm not there, and he uses my absence as further proof that I've betrayed the family, priming everyone to side with him regardless of what I ultimately do. Priyasha nodded slowly. It's actually elegant, in a deeply ugly way. He built a scenario where you lose, no matter what you choose, unless you refuse to play at all. I want to add one more piece of that morning's conversation, because it's the moment I finally, fully understood what my role in the family had actually been all along, stated plainly rather than dressed up in the language of obligation and love. You know what the actual tell is, Priyasha said, tapping the balance sheet on her tablet. It's not that he asked you for money. Parents ask their kids for help sometimes. That happens in healthy families too. It's that he never once asked you as an equal making a request. He asked you the way you'd instruct an employee, or draw down a credit line. There's no version of this plan that includes the possibility of you saying no, and that being the end of it. He built the whole thing assuming your no wasn't a real option. Because it never had been before, I said, and hearing myself say it out loud, in that flat, clinical conference room, made something in me settle in a way that hadn't settled during the actual dinner, or the actual text message, or any of the more dramatic moments that came before or after. It was simply, quietly, the truest sentence in the whole ordeal. My no had never been a real option before. Every no I'd ever attempted over 21 years had eventually been worn down, guilt-tripped, or simply overridden, until saying yes became less exhausting than continuing to say no. This was the first no in my entire life, with the institutional weight of a company, a legal team, and a documented paper trail standing behind it. It was the first no that was actually going to hold. Eden, who'd been quiet for a moment, looked up from her laptop. "There's one more thing you should think about before we send anything. Once this letter goes out, there's no version of this where it stays quiet. He's going to make noise. He's going to make it public, or try to. Are you ready for that? Because the version of you sitting at that dinner table 3 days ago wasn't." I thought about the question seriously before answering, because it deserved a serious answer. "I've spent 21 years being quiet so this family could stay comfortable," I said finally. "I think it's their turn to be uncomfortable for a while. I'm ready." "So we don't play," I said. "Send the demand letter. Full repayment in 15 days, or we file a lien on the manufacturing plant." The demand letter went out by courier that afternoon. By 9 that night my building's intercom buzzed, Desmond, Rhett, and Anders, standing in my lobby, having talked their way past the front desk. I want to describe the hour before that buzzer rang, because I spent it in a state I hadn't expected. After the war room session that morning, after the demand letter went out, I'd gone home expecting some kind of immediate confrontation, and when none came by early evening, I'd let myself relax slightly, cooking dinner, half watching something on television, almost believing for an hour or two that the day's events might simply be allowed to settle without further escalation. I understand now how naive that hope was. Desmond had never once, in 21 years, let a challenge to his authority go unanswered for even a single night. I should have known the calm was only ever going to be temporary. I watched them on the hallway camera outside my door, instead of letting them up. Desmond was pounding, red-faced, shouting something the door swallowed most of. Rhett paced. Anders looked like he desperately wanted to be anywhere else. I hit the intercom. "You're trespassing." "Open the door, Marlon. We need to talk like men," Desmond barked. "There's nothing to discuss. You voted. Blood only, remember? I'm simply respecting the outcome." "Come on, man," Rhett said, leaning toward the camera. "It was a joke, you know how I get. Just wire the deposit and we'll sort the rest out at the lake." "There is no Bank of Marlin anymore," I said. "You have 60 seconds to leave before I call building security and have you removed for trespassing." Desmond slammed his fist against the door one final time. "I put a roof over your head. I fed you. You owe me." "I owe you the balance of a signed promissory note," I said. "Nothing else. You'll be hearing from my attorney." I called down to security. 3 minutes later I watched, calm as still water, as they were escorted out. I want to add one more detail from that night, something I didn't fully process until much later. As the security guards were walking the three of them toward the elevator, the hallway camera caught a brief exchange I only reviewed properly weeks afterward, when Priyasha asked me to pull the footage as potential evidence for the harassment claim. Anders, walking a few steps behind Desmond and Rhett, muttered something under his breath that the camera's microphone barely picked up. "I had it enhanced," he'd said, quietly, mostly to himself. "This is insane. I told you this would happen." It was the first hint I had that Anders had perhaps understood, better than either Desmond or Rhett, exactly how badly this midnight visit was going to land, and had come along anyway, rather than risk being seen as disloyal to Blythe's family in front of investors he was still hoping to court. Even his private doubt, in other words, had been calculated for optics, rather than offered as any genuine objection. I want to describe the specific quality of the silence in my apartment after the elevator doors closed on them, because it was different from any silence I'd experienced before. I stood at the security panel for a long moment, watching the empty hallway on the camera feed, listening to nothing at all, no pounding, no shouting, no anticipatory dread about what the next escalation might look like. I realized, standing there, that I'd never once in my adult life experienced a genuinely clean ending to a conflict with that family. Every previous disagreement had simply faded, unresolved, absorbed back into the general operating pattern of the household, until the next one arrived to replace it. This was the first time a confrontation had an actual, physical conclusion. Guards, an elevator, a closed door, nothing left dangling to be picked back up later, on someone else's terms. I want to describe what I did after, because it says something about where my head actually was that night, underneath the calm. I didn't celebrate. And I didn't collapse either. I poured myself a glass of water, sat at my kitchen table, and called my old engineering mentor from community college, A woman named Frantiska, who taught my very first circuits class and who had, over the years, become something closer to family than anyone with the Okafor Ren name had ever managed to be. I told her everything, start to finish, my voice steady, in a way that surprised even me. "You sound calm," she said when I finished. "I feel calm," I said, and I meant it. I think I expected to feel devastated. I think some part of me has been braced for this exact night for 21 years, and now that it's actually here, it just feels like relief. Like setting down something heavy I didn't realize I'd been carrying the whole time. "That's not nothing," Frantiska said. "That's actually the whole thing, if you ask me." I want to include a bit more of that conversation because Frantiska said something else that night that I've held on to since. I asked her, somewhat sheepishly, whether she thought I was being too harsh, too final. Whether there was a version of this where I found some middle ground that didn't involve legal liens and blocked phone numbers. "You spent 21 years finding middle ground, Marlon," she said. "I watched you do it, from a distance, every single year you came back to visit me, and told me some new story about a loan or a bailout, or a slight you'd decided to let go for the sake of peace. Middle ground was never actually neutral territory. It was just the territory they kept moving the line into, over and over. Because you kept letting them. I don't think what you did tonight was harsh. I think it was the first time in 2 decades you actually held a line instead of just marking where it used to be." The next morning, I had a scheduled meeting at my office with Halden Voss, a venture investor considering leading our Series B round. We were shaking hands in the lobby when the glass doors slammed open, and Desmond, Rhett, and Anders stormed in, disheveled, having clearly not slept. "Marlon." Desmond's voice echoed off the marble. I turned to Voss. "My apologies. One moment." Rhett got in my face before security could react. "You ungrateful little charity case, you think a fancy office makes you better than us? You're nothing without this family, and you're going to wire that money right now or I'll tell everyone in this lobby exactly what kind of fake you are." Charity case. The words landed hard and public, and the lobby went dead silent. I want to describe that specific silence, because I've thought about it often since. It wasn't the silence of a crowd unmoved. Corvid's lobby, at 9 in the morning on a weekday, was full of people. Employees arriving for the day, a delivery courier, 2 clients waiting for an earlier meeting. Every one of them had stopped, mid-motion, to watch. I remember with strange clarity, seeing Priscilla, no, not Priscilla, I caught myself, seeing our receptionist, a young woman named Ottiline frozen behind the front desk with her hand still on the phone she'd been about to answer, her eyes wide with the specific alarm of someone witnessing something they don't yet have a category for. I remember thinking, in the middle of that frozen moment, how strange it was that after 21 years of this exact dynamic playing out entirely behind closed doors, it was finally happening in the one room in my life that was unambiguously, structurally mine. Built by me, staffed by people who respected me, protected by security I employed. The contrast between the room and the scene playing out inside it felt, for a fraction of a second, almost surreal. Voss stepped between us before I could speak, his voice quiet but carrying. "You used the word charity case like a weapon. Interesting choice." He turned to Rhett fully. "I spent 6 years in foster care before I was adopted by people who understood what family actually means. I've also spent 30 years in finance watching entitled men squander what other people built. I can tell exactly which one you are within about 10 seconds of meeting you." Desmond went pale. Halden Voss's name meant something in every boardroom in the state. Security arrived and walked all 3 of them out under Voss's unbothered gaze. "Well," Voss said, adjusting his jacket, "shall we discuss the funding round?" I want to note that the meeting that followed was, against every expectation I'd carried into the building that morning, one of the best of my professional life. Voss didn't dwell on what he'd witnessed beyond that single comment in the lobby. He simply moved forward, treating me exactly as he had before the doors burst open, as a founder worth $50 million of his firm's confidence, not as a man whose family had just tried to publicly humiliate him. It was, I realized afterward, the first time in longer than I could remember that someone in a position of real power over my future had watched my family behave badly toward me and simply refused to let it change how he saw me. That refusal, small as it might have seemed to him, did more to repair something in me than any of the courtroom victories that followed ever would. I want to describe one more moment from later that same meeting, because Voss said something afterward, almost as an aside while we were reviewing the term sheet, that I've thought about often since. We'd finished discussing valuation and were waiting for his associate to print a revised document, and he set his pen down and looked at me directly. "I don't usually comment on things like what happened downstairs," he said. "It's not really my business. But I'll say this once, and then we'll go back to discussing your cap table. I built my first fund with a business partner who turned out to be embezzling from our earliest investors. It took me 2 years to unwind that mess, and most of it happened in rooms exactly like this one, with people asking me hard questions about my judgment. What I learned, going through that, is that the people who matter in your life going forward are never the ones who caused the crisis. They're the ones who watch how you handle it and decide right then whether you're worth staying close to. I watched how you handled it about 90 seconds ago. I think you're worth staying close to." I didn't have a polished response to that. I simply thanked him, quietly, and we moved on to the cap table, but I carried that exchange with me for months afterward. A small, unexpected data point in the slow, ongoing project of recalibrating exactly whose judgment of me was actually worth trusting. I want to add one final detail from that day, because it's small, but it mattered to me disproportionately at the time. Adeline, the receptionist, found me at the end of the afternoon, just before I left the building, and told me, a little shyly, that she wanted me to know. The whole front desk team had talked about it during their lunch break, and that nobody thought less of me for what had happened, if anything the opposite. "For what it's worth," she said, "you handled it better than anyone I've ever seen handle anything like that. I just wanted you to know people noticed, and it wasn't the story you're probably telling yourself in your head right now." I thanked her, and I meant it more than the brief exchange probably conveyed. I've thought since about how much of the actual healing in this whole ordeal came not from the legal victories or the financial reckonings, but from small, unprompted moments like that one. People I barely knew taking 30 seconds out of their day to tell me, plainly, that the story I was afraid they were telling about me wasn't the one they were actually telling at all. That afternoon, Idun and I finalized a single, calm, entirely factual email. No insults, no rage, just documented reality, and sent it, blind copied, to 54 members of the extended Okafor-Wren family, aunts, uncles, cousins, family friends. It explained, plainly, that I had been formally excluded from the family reunion, and that as I was apparently no longer considered family, I would no longer be quietly funding it. Attached was an itemized accounting, $90,000 for the unpaid bridge loan, $62,000 across Rhett's 2 failed ventures, $21,600 for Priscilla's medical costs, and $37,400 in smaller bailouts. Total, $211,000. I want to describe assembling that list, specifically, because it required me to go back through 7 years of bank statements, some of them from an old account I'd nearly forgotten I'd used, cross-referencing dates against memory, against old text threads, against a handful of paper receipts I'd apparently kept without quite knowing why. It took most of the afternoon, and it was, in its own strange way, one of the more clarifying exercises of my life. Watching an abstract, diffuse sense of having been taken advantage of resolve, line by line, into concrete, dated, verifiable fact. There is a particular kind of relief in that transformation. Feelings can be argued with, dismissed, reframed by someone skilled enough at reframing. A bank statement cannot. I also called the card company and canceled the authorized user credit card Rhett had talked Desmond into getting me to co-sign years earlier. The one Rhett used, unbeknownst to me until Idun checked, almost exclusively at a downtown watch boutique. Idun's cousin worked there part-time. 20 minutes later she got a text. Rhett had tried to buy a $6,000 watch to wear to the lake. Declined. Twice. In front of Anders. I want to describe the small, specific satisfaction of that particular phone call to the card company, because it was the one action in the entire ordeal that felt less like legal warfare, and more like simply, finally, taking back something that had always belonged to me. The representative on the line asked, as a formality, for my reason for canceling the secondary card, and I remember the odd pleasure of saying plainly into the phone, "The account holder is no longer authorized to use my credit," and having the representative simply process it, no argument, no guilt trip, no lengthy negotiation, Just a straightforward transaction between me and an institution that had no emotional stake in the outcome whatsoever. It was, in its own small way, a preview of what the rest of my life could look like once I stopped conducting my most important relationships through the emotionally loaded, endlessly negotiable terms my family had always insisted on. I want to be honest that drafting that email took longer than the 2 hours it might sound like from the summary. Idun and I went through 6 separate versions, cutting anything that read as bitter, anything that sounded like it was still trying to win an argument rather than simply state a fact. The version we finally sent contained no adjectives about their character at all, no toxic, no cruel, no hypocritical. Just dates, dollar amounts, and the single unembellished sentence explaining why the funding had stopped, because the family that received it had voted, unanimously and without my knowledge, that I no longer counted as family at all. "You could add more," Idun said, reading over the final draft. "You could really let them have it." "I don't need to," I said. "The numbers already say everything I'd want to say, and they say it better than I could, because nobody can accuse a spreadsheet of being dramatic. I want to describe the actual moment of sending it, because it carried a weight I hadn't fully anticipated." Idun sat beside me at my kitchen table, both of us staring at the compose window for a long moment before I finally moved the cursor to the send button. "Once this goes," she said quietly, "there's no version of this family that exists the same way again. You understand that?" "I understand that," I said. "I think that version of this family stopped existing a long time before tonight. This is just the first time anyone's told the truth about it in writing." I clicked send. 54 inboxes, somewhere out in the world, quietly received a message that was going to unravel, over the following days and weeks. A version of the Okafor-Wren family that had existed, at least on the surface, for as long as I'd been alive. I didn't feel triumphant watching the little confirmation appear on my screen. I felt mostly tired, the specific, bone-deep tiredness of finally setting down something I'd been carrying so long I'd nearly forgotten what it felt like to walk without it. By evening, my great-aunt Solveig, the one relative who'd always treated me like an actual nephew rather than a project, posted publicly in the extended family's group chat, tagging Desmond and Priscilla directly. She was disgusted, she wasn't coming to the lake, and she called the whole arrangement a stain that won't wash out. Cousins I hadn't spoken to in years began messaging me privately, shocked, angry on my behalf. I want to describe a handful of those messages, because the range of reactions taught me something about how differently people had actually experienced the same family over the years, depending on their proximity to Desmond's temper and their distance from his wallet. My cousin Idris, who'd grown up 2 towns over and only saw the family at holidays, wrote to say he'd always assumed I was simply quiet, never realizing the quietness had a cause. My cousin Rena, closer to Desmond's side, and more entangled in his business dealings, wrote something considerably more defensive, suggesting I should have handled this privately, rather than airing it to the whole family. A response that told me plainly which side of the ledger she'd always positioned herself on, whether she recognized it or not. I want to include one more of those messages specifically, because it came from someone I hadn't expected to hear from at all. My cousin Fenwick, Desmond's nephew through his late brother, someone I'd maybe exchanged a dozen words with over the entire course of my life, sent a long, careful message describing his own experience growing up on the periphery of the same extended family, not excluded the way I had been but always aware, he wrote, of an unspoken hierarchy that ranked people by their proximity to Desmond's approval, their usefulness to his image, their willingness to defer. "I always felt like a minor character in someone else's story at every family gathering," he wrote, "but you were the one actually paying for the production. I'm sorry it took this long for anyone to say that out loud." I hadn't expected, going into that email, to discover that my exclusion had somehow illuminated a pattern other people had been quietly living inside for years without fully naming it either. It made the whole ordeal feel less like an isolated betrayal, and more like the surfacing of something structural that had been organizing that entire extended family's dynamics for far longer than my own 21 years in it. I want to add that Fenwick and I have kept in touch since, occasionally, in a way I hadn't anticipated. We've never become close in any conventional sense, but there's a kind of quiet solidarity between us now, 2 people who separately spent years reading the same family's unspoken hierarchy from different, equally uncomfortable vantage points. He sent me a message on the 1-year anniversary of that email, simply saying he hoped I was doing well, and I've come to understand that gesture as its own small, unexpected gift. Proof that even a family built largely on convenience and hierarchy can occasionally produce a genuine, if minor, connection between two people who happen to recognize the same thing in each other. Priscilla called my unlisted office line that evening, sobbing, begging me to retract the email, to say it was a misunderstanding, to protect the family's image. When I asked her plainly whether she'd voted to exclude me, she admitted she hadn't voted. She simply hadn't said anything against it. That was the moment I understood she wasn't a passive victim of Desmond's control. She was a willing beneficiary of my money, who'd simply never had to look directly at where it came from. I'm not taking this down, I told her. I'm not protecting a family that watched me get humiliated at a dinner table, and then asked me to fund the party celebrating it. Don't call this line again. I want to describe one more call from that evening, because it was the one that actually hurt, in a way the others hadn't. My sister Blythe called, not sobbing like Priscilla, not shouting like Desmond, just quiet, almost businesslike. "You've ruined the wedding," she said. Anders's investors were going to be at the reunion. His parents were going to meet everyone. "You've made us look insane." "You voted me out of the family, Blythe," I said. In writing, more or less, in front of everyone at that table. I didn't ruin anything. I just stopped paying for the ruins. "It wasn't personal," she said. "It was optics. You understand optics. You run a company." "It was extremely personal," I said. "You just didn't think I'd notice, because you'd never had to think about my feelings as a real cost before. They'd always been free." She didn't have a response to that. She hung up a few seconds later, and I sat with the silence afterward for a long time, understanding that of everyone at that table, Blythe's cruelty had never been Desmond's blunt entitlement, or Rhett's casual malice. It had been something colder. A simple, practical willingness to sacrifice me whenever it was convenient, dressed up in the vocabulary of business as though family were just another stakeholder relationship to be managed. Rhett texted me last, close to midnight, and his message was different from the others. Shorter and stranger, in a way that stayed with me longer than I expected. "I know I never say this, but you were always the only one of us who actually worked for anything. I think that's why none of us could stand having you in the room." I read that message 4 or 5 times, trying to decide whether it was a genuine moment of clarity or simply the latest, most sophisticated version of the manipulation I'd been navigating for 2 decades. I never fully decided. I didn't respond either way. Some doors, once you finally understand what's actually been happening on the other side of them, don't need to be reopened just because someone finally knocks with something honest. I want to include one more piece of that night, because it's the detail I've thought about most in the months since. Desmond himself never called that evening, not once, though he'd been the loudest voice at my door only hours earlier. It was Idun who pointed out, days later, what that silence probably meant. "He's not sorry," she said when I mentioned it. "Everyone else called because they were scared of what they were about to lose. He didn't call because he was still trying to figure out his next move. That man doesn't do remorse, he does strategy." She turned out, as she often did, to be exactly right. I want to add one final piece to that night's account. Something small that I've never mentioned to anyone until now. Around 2 in the morning, unable to sleep, I found myself scrolling back through old photos on my phone, not deliberately looking for anything, just the aimless late-night habit of a mind too wired to rest. I came across a photo from the lake, maybe 8 years old, of Rhett and me on the dock at sunrise. Both of us holding fishing rods, both of us actually smiling, the kind of unposed, genuine photo that gets taken by accident when nobody's performing for anyone. I sat with that photo for a long time. I didn't cry, though I came close. I think what I felt, looking at it, wasn't quite grief for the family I'd just severed ties with. I'd done my grieving for that family, in installments, over 21 years. It was something more specific. Grief for the version of that morning I'd believed, at the time, was simply an ordinary, happy memory, and that I now understood with everything I'd learned in the preceding 24 hours, might have simply been one of the rare moments when the performance briefly, accidentally became real. I don't know if that morning was genuine warmth, or simply a lull between one manipulation and the next. I've decided since, that it doesn't actually matter which it was. Either way, it was real to me at the time. And I'm allowed to have lost something true even while cutting away something that had turned out to be false. 2 days later, Desmond's attorney requested an emergency meeting. Desmond and Rhett arrived looking like they'd aged a decade in a week. Desmond gray-faced, hands trembling, Rhett silent, and staring at the table. I remember sitting in Priyasha's office beforehand, going over the numbers one final time, and feeling for the first time since the whole ordeal began, something. Almost like calm rather than adrenaline. The particular steadiness that comes from knowing, with total certainty, exactly what you intend to say, and exactly why. I want to describe walking into that conference room, because it was a strange experience I hadn't fully anticipated. I'd pictured, in the days leading up to it, feeling something triumphant. Some clean sense of finally winning after 21 years of losing quietly. What I actually felt, watching Desmond struggle to unbutton his suit jacket with hands that wouldn't stop shaking, was closer to a kind of clinical sadness, the specific, unglamorous feeling of watching a structure you once genuinely wanted to believe in finally fully collapse in front of you, with nothing left to salvage from the wreckage but the honest accounting of what it had actually cost. I noticed too that Priscilla and Blythe weren't in the room, and I asked before anyone else spoke where they were. They didn't think it was appropriate for them to attend, Desmond's attorney said carefully. This is a business matter. I almost laughed at that. 21 years of being told family didn't operate on business terms, and the very first time the numbers turned against them, family conveniently became a business matter that only the men needed to handle. It was, in its own small way, the most honest thing anyone in that family had said to me in weeks. Desmond offered me 50% equity in his failing supply business and the CEO title, begging me to forgive the $90,000 loan and cover the looming $400,000 balloon payment. I almost laughed. His machinery was outdated, his client base bleeding out to competitors, and he was offering me a sinking ship in exchange for erasing his debt. I don't want your company, I said. In fact, you should know. Corvid signed an exclusive 10-year contract this week with Halverson Logistics Group, your biggest competitor. Our software is about to let them undercut your remaining contracts by nearly a fifth. Desmond's face went the color of old paper. You did this, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. You destroyed your own family. No, I said, and I felt, saying it, that this was the truest sentence I'd spoken in that entire ordeal. You destroyed a family that happened to include me, a long time before I ever opened a spreadsheet. I just stopped covering up the wreckage. Rhett spoke for the first time in the whole meeting, his voice thin, none of the smirk left in it. I never actually thought you'd stop, any of it. The money, I mean. I think some part of me thought you liked it, being needed. I looked at him for a long moment before answering, feeling something close to pity move through me, quickly, and then pass. I think you confused being needed with being wanted for a very long time, Rhett. They're not the same thing. One of them costs you money, the other one doesn't cost anything at all. And you and I never actually got to find out what that felt like, because nobody in this family ever offered me the second one. I don't want 50% of nothing, I said, standing. You wanted a reunion for blood only. Enjoy it. Blood's the only thing you'll have left. I want to describe the physical sensation of standing up in that moment, because it stayed with me more vividly than almost anything I said. I remember my knees feeling strange, almost unsteady. Not from fear but from the sheer unfamiliarity of the posture. A grown man, in a room full of people who'd spent 2 decades teaching him to make himself smaller, simply standing at his full height and ending a conversation on his own terms. I don't think I'd ever done that in that family's presence before. Not once. Not even in small, low-stakes disagreements. My body didn't quite know what to do with the sensation of it. I want to include one final exchange from that room, because Desmond said something on my way out that I've never fully been able to shake, even years later. As I reached the door, he called after me, his voice smaller than I'd ever heard it. You were never supposed to be the one who left, he said. You were supposed to be the one who stayed no matter what. That was always your role. I turned back to look at him one last time. A gray, diminished man in a conference room, finally saying out loud the thing that had governed every interaction between us for 21 years. I know, I said. That's exactly the problem. I walked out into the hallway, and I remember standing there for a moment, alone, before I made it to the elevator, simply breathing, letting the weight of what had just happened settle into my body in a way I hadn't allowed myself to feel inside the room itself. Priyasha found me there a minute later, having stepped out just after me, and she didn't say anything at first. She just stood beside me, quietly, until I was ready to move. "You okay?" she asked finally. "I don't know yet," I said honestly. "I think I will be. I don't think I am yet." "That's a reasonable place to be standing," she said. "You don't have to have the feelings sorted out before the elevator arrives." I walked out. Priyasha filed the lien the following Monday, when the payment didn't clear. Over the following months, exactly what the numbers predicted came true. Desmond's business filed for bankruptcy protection in the fall. The family home was sold to cover the secondary loan. Rhett cut off entirely, took a job selling used cars and moved into a friend's spare room. Blythe and Anders, whose loyalty had never extended past convenience, quietly distanced themselves the moment the money stopped flowing. I want to include one detail about Blythe specifically, because I heard about it much later, and it stayed with me. After her engagement to Anders dissolved, Idris mentioned, in one of our periodic updates, that Blythe had moved to a different city entirely, taking a marketing position at a firm 2 states away, apparently wanting a fresh start somewhere. Nobody knew the shape of what had happened to her family. I felt, hearing that, an odd and unexpected pang of something like sympathy, quickly checked by the memory of her voice on the phone that night. It wasn't personal, it was optics, and the specific coldness with which she'd weighed my feelings against her wedding logistics. Sympathy and clear-eyed accountability aren't mutually exclusive, I've learned. You can genuinely hope someone eventually builds a better life, while still declining to be the one who helps them build it. I want to describe how I learned about the house sale specifically, because it's the piece of this whole story that came closest to genuinely shaking my resolve. Desmond and Priscilla had lived in that house for over 30 years. It was, whatever else it had been, the only home I'd ever known after the fire, the place where I'd built the balsa wood bridge, where I'd hidden $400 under a drawer, where I'd sat through hundreds of dinners trying to earn a place that was never actually mine to earn. Idris, my cousin, sent me a photo he'd taken driving past, a real estate sign staked into the front lawn, the same lawn I'd mowed as a teenager for an allowance that mysteriously never quite materialized in full. I stared at that photo for a long time. I felt something complicated, not quite grief and not quite satisfaction, closer to the specific ache of watching a chapter of your life get physically demolished in front of you, even a chapter you'd spent years trying to escape. I called Osei that same week, and spent most of the session simply trying to name the feeling, without much success. He suggested, eventually, that maybe it didn't need a single name. That grief for a childhood home, and relief at finally being free of what happened inside it, could coexist without canceling each other out, and that expecting myself to feel only one cleaning emotion about any of it was probably an unfair standard I was still holding myself to out of old habit. I didn't celebrate. I felt something quieter than triumph, a wound finally, fully cleaned out. I want to add one more reflection here, because it's the closest I've come to reconciling the two feelings that coexisted in me during that stretch of months. Relief and a genuine, if complicated, grief. I think for a long time, I believed those two feelings had to cancel each other out. That feeling relief somehow proved the grief wasn't real, or that feeling grief somehow undermined my right to the relief. Osei helped me understand, slowly, that they were simply two accurate readings of two different things. The relief was for myself, for the life I finally got to build without a constant, invisible drain running underneath it. The grief was for the family I'd wanted, the one I'd spent 21 years hoping the Okafor Wrens might eventually become, even though the evidence had always suggested they never would. Both were true. Neither one needed the other's permission to exist. I wanted to describe the months of quiet that followed in a bit more detail, because I think the loud part of this story, the lobby, the lien, the bankruptcy, is the part people always want to hear, and the quiet part is the part that actually mattered. I took a real vacation that autumn, my first in 4 years that wasn't tied to a conference or a client visit. I went alone, to a small coastal town 6 hours from the city, and spent a week doing nothing more ambitious than walking the shoreline and reading books I'd been meaning to get to for a decade. I remember standing on a rocky outcrop on the third evening, watching the tide come in, and realizing that for the first time since I was 11 years old, I wasn't carrying a single unresolved obligation toward anyone who shared my adoptive family's last name, the feeling wasn't triumphant. It was simply spacious, in a way I hadn't experienced since before I understood what it meant to be someone's charity case. I want to describe a few of the ordinary days of that vacation, because they mattered to me more than any single dramatic moment. I woke early most mornings, made coffee in the small rental kitchen, and walked the beach before the town properly woke up, watching fishing boats head out past the breakwater. I had no calls to take, no crises to manage, no family obligations, quietly humming in the back of my mind the way they always had, even during previous vacations, even when I told myself I'd successfully compartmentalized them. I found myself, by the fourth day, genuinely bored in a way I hadn't allowed myself to be in years, and I remember the specific, novel discomfort of that boredom slowly resolving into something closer to peace. The recognition that a mind constantly braced for the next demand doesn't know, at first, what to do with genuine stillness, and needs time to relearn it. Idun visited me there for the last 2 days, and we sat on the porch of the rental house one evening with a bottle of wine, not really talking business, which was rare for us. "You know what the strangest part of all this was for me," she said, watching from the outside. "It wasn't the lobby scene or the bankruptcy. It was how calm you were the whole time. I kept waiting for you to break down, and you never did." "I think I did most of my breaking down over the 21 years before that dinner," I said. "By the time it actually happened, there wasn't much left to break. I think that's actually the sad part if you want the honest version, not the family falling apart. That the grief had already mostly finished its work by the time the ending finally arrived." Great Aunt Solveig and I started meeting for coffee every other week. She told me plainly, over the first of those coffees, that she'd watched what happened to me for years, and regretted every time she'd stayed silent. "I used to tell myself it wasn't my place," she said, stirring her tea slowly. "That Desmond was my brother, and it wasn't my business how he raised his children. I think that was a coward's excuse dressed up as respect for boundaries. I'm sorry it took you burning the whole thing down for me to finally say something." "You're saying it now," I told her. "That counts for more than you think." I want to describe those early coffee meetings with Solveig, in a bit more detail, because they became, over time, one of the most important relationships to emerge from the entire ordeal. She was in her 70s by then, sharp as ever, and she brought to our conversations a kind of unflinching honesty I'd rarely encountered from anyone in that family. She told me, over our second or third visit, that she'd actually confronted Desmond directly, decades earlier, about a much smaller version of the same pattern. A birthday party thrown for Rhett that conspicuously excluded acknowledgement of mine, which fell only 2 weeks later that same year. "He told me I was being dramatic," she said, "that I didn't understand what it meant to raise 2 children who came from such different circumstances. I let him talk me out of my own eyes, Marlon. I saw the pattern back then, clear as anything, and I let him convince me I hadn't. I think that's the real shame of it. Not that I never noticed, but that I let myself be talked out of what I noticed, over and over, for 20 years. I didn't have a response to that beyond simple gratitude that she was telling me now, however late it had come. I've thought since about how much of the entire ordeal traced back to exactly that mechanism. Not just Desmond's cruelty, but the family's collective, practiced willingness to let him talk everyone else out of what they'd plainly seen with their own eyes. I want to describe one more of those coffee conversations, because Solveig told me something during our third or fourth visit that reframed a piece of my childhood I'd never fully understood. She'd known my birth mother, it turned out, better than I'd realized. They'd attended the same church group decades earlier, before I was born. "Your mother," Solveig said, "was one of the kindest women I ever knew, fiercely protective of the people she loved, in a quiet way. I always wondered, watching how Desmond treated you, over the years, what she would have made of it. I think she would have been furious. I think she would have been the first one at your door helping you pack, telling you to never look back." I didn't cry in that moment, though I came close. I simply sat, with the strange, quiet comfort of imagining, for the first time in years, that somewhere in the family I'd actually been born into, there might have been someone who would have fought for me the way I'd always wished the Okafor Wrens would, if she'd only lived long enough to get the chance. Months later, at a small gathering on my own building's rooftop, people who were there because they chose to be, not because blood demanded it, she handed me a legal envelope. She'd removed Desmond as beneficiary of the small family trust her own parents had established generations ago, and named me instead. "Blood didn't make you family," she said. "You did. Every year you showed up anyway. That's worth infinitely more than DNA ever was." I want to describe what an ordinary week actually looked like. Roughly 18 months after that Sunday dinner, because I think the loud parts of this story, the lobby, confrontation, the lien, the bankruptcy filing, tend to overshadow the thing that actually mattered most, which was considerably less dramatic and considerably more valuable. Corvid closed its Series B. That winter, the Round Halden Voss had been considering the morning Desmond stormed our lobby. The funding let us expand into 2 new regional markets and double our engineering staff within the year. I found myself, for the first time in my adult life, running a company that felt less like a desperate, all-consuming bid for validation, and more like simply good, satisfying work. The difference being, I came to realize, that I no longer needed the company's success to prove anything to anyone sitting at a dining table I no longer visited. I want to describe one specific hire from that expansion, because it taught me something about how the whole ordeal had actually changed the way I led. We brought on a junior engineer named Percival, 23. Sharp, but visibly anxious in his first few weeks, the kind of new hire who apologized before asking questions, and flinched slightly whenever a senior colleague raised their voice even in ordinary enthusiasm. I recognized the pattern instantly, the way you recognize a stranger's accent as belonging to your own hometown. I made a point, over his first month, of pulling him aside after meetings, not to correct his work, which was consistently excellent, but simply to tell him, plainly, that he didn't need to apologize for asking a clarifying question, that his ideas were welcome even when they contradicted a more senior engineer's, that being wrong occasionally was simply part of doing difficult work, rather than a referendum on his right to be in the room at all. I watched him, over the following months, slowly unclench. The same way I imagine I'd slowly unclenched years earlier under Priya's mentorship, except this time I was the one doing the unclenching for someone else, and I understood, watching it happen, that this was probably the truest, most durable revenge available to me, not destroying the family that had taught me to shrink, but actively building the opposite of that lesson into every room I now had the power to shape. I want to say a word here about Priya, because she deserves more than the single passing mention I've given her. She'd been my supervisor at my very first engineering job out of community college, years before Corvid existed, and she'd been the first adult in my professional life to treat my ideas as worth defending in rooms I wasn't present for. I called her the week after the settlement meeting, mostly just to tell her what had happened, and she listened, quiet and unhurried, the way she always had. "You built a whole company," she said when I finished, "and it took your family losing theirs for you to finally believe you were allowed to stop rescuing people who never once tried to rescue you. I wish that lesson had come cheaper, but I'm glad it came." "You saw this coming, didn't you?" I said, "years ago, when I used to tell you those stories about them?" "I saw the shape of it," she said. "I didn't know exactly how it would end, I just knew you were carrying something that was going to eventually get too heavy to keep carrying quietly. I'm glad you finally put it down instead of letting it break your back first." I want to add one more thing Priya said on that call, because it stayed with me longer than almost anything else anyone told me during the whole ordeal. "You spent your whole career proving you could build things that lasted," she said. "Systems, companies, relationships with people who actually deserved your loyalty. I think the hardest lesson in all of this is realizing that the same discipline you used to build all of that, the patience, the refusal to cut corners, the willingness to do the unglamorous work, was also the exact thing that kept you invested in a family that was never going to reward it. You're not bad at building things, Marlon. You were simply building in soil that could never grow anything back." I started seeing a therapist that spring, a quiet, unhurried man named Osei, who specialized, as it happened, in adult adoptees, and the specific, tangled grief of losing a family you were never fully allowed to belong to in the first place. I want to be honest that I resisted the idea for months before finally making the appointment, telling myself I'd already handled everything through spreadsheets and legal filings, that emotional processing was simply a less efficient version of what I'd already accomplished through action. Osei gently, patiently disagreed, over the course of many sessions, and I came to understand that cutting off the Okafor wrens had solved the practical problem of ongoing exploitation, but had not, on its own, resolved the older, quieter question of why I'd spent 21 years believing I had to earn a place I should have simply been given. "You keep describing your success as the thing that finally let you leave," Jose observed, in one of our early sessions. I gently pushed back on that. I think the success was real and matters on its own terms. But I don't think it's what let you leave. I think what let you leave was finally believing you deserved to. I sat with that for a long time after the session ended, turning it over on the drive home, and I think it's the single truest thing anyone said to me in the entire aftermath of that dinner, truer, in its way, than anything in the legal filings or the demand letters, because it named the actual mechanism rather than just the visible result. I want to describe one more session with Jose, a few months into the work, because it reframed something about Rhett that I hadn't expected to reconsider. I'd been describing him, as I usually did, in flat, unsympathetic terms: the golden child, the perpetual failure, the man who'd never once had to earn anything. Jose listened, then asked a question that stopped me. "Do you think Rhett ever had a real choice in who he became?" "Everyone has a choice," I said, more defensively than I intended. "Maybe," Jose said. "But I'd gently point out that you were handed responsibility from the time you were 11 years old, and you built an entire identity around meeting it. Rhett was handed the opposite, an environment that actively discouraged him from ever developing the muscle of earning anything, because it was always simply given. That's not an excuse for how he treated you. The cruelty was his own, and he's responsible for it. But I think there's a version of this story where you're not the only casualty of that household. You're just the one who had the raw material, and the external pressure, to build something in spite of it. He never had either." I didn't fully accept that framing, not that day, and I'm still not sure I fully accept it now. But it softened something in me toward Rhett that I hadn't expected to soften. A recognition that his failures, however genuinely infuriating, weren't purely a personal moral defect. They were also, in some meaningful part, the predictable output of a household that had spent his entire life teaching him that consequences were something that happened to other people. I want to describe one more relationship that grew out of that period, because it surprised me more than almost anything else. Wendell Farrow, the supplier Desmond had tried to pressure, called me himself about 4 months after the incident, apologizing again, more fully this time, and asking whether we could have coffee. I almost declined. I went anyway, mostly out of curiosity, and found a man who was genuinely ashamed of how quickly he'd folded under pressure from an old family friend, and who wanted, in his own halting way, to make it right beyond the business relationship we'd already repaired. "I keep thinking about it," he told me, turning his coffee cup slowly on the table between us. "How easily I almost let him use me against you. I've known Desmond 25 years. I've known you 3. And for about an hour there I was ready to burn our whole business relationship because an old golf buddy raised his voice at me. I don't know what that says about me, but I don't think it's good. It says you're human, and he's very good at applying pressure to the exact points where people are weakest," I said. "I spent 21 years being pressured by the same man. You get a pass for one phone call." We've stayed in touch since, not close friends exactly, but something more genuine than the purely transactional relationship we'd had before. Proof, I think, that even people who'd briefly been leveraged against me weren't necessarily beyond a real, if modest, kind of repair. Part 13, Rhett, 3 years later. I want to include one more thread, out of chronological order, because it happened much later than everything else in this account, and because I think it complicates the ending in a way that feels more honest than a clean resolution would. Almost 3 years after that Sunday dinner, I got a call from an unfamiliar number with an out-of-state area code. I almost let it go to voicemail. Something made me answer. "Marlon. It's Rhett." I hadn't heard his voice in nearly 3 years, not since the settlement meeting where he'd told me he thought I'd liked being needed. He sounded different, flatter, older, none of the old performance left in it. "I'm not calling to ask for anything," he said, before I could respond. "I know that's usually how these calls started. I wanted you to know that first." "Okay," I said, cautious, waiting. "I've been in a program for about a year," he said. "Not Nothing dramatic, nothing like what you're probably picturing. Just a financial counseling thing actually through the dealership where I still work. They do this course for employees who want to actually understand money, instead of just moving it around. I'm the only one in the class who's $41,000 in debt from 2 failed businesses that weren't mine to start with the money I didn't earn. He laughed, short and humorless, an echo of a laugh I recognized from somewhere much older than either of us wanted to admit. I've been doing the actual math, is what I'm trying to say, on my own for the first time. And I wanted to call you, not to apologize exactly, because I don't think an apology from me means much of anything at this point. I just wanted you to know I finally understand what an actual dollar costs, now that I'm the one earning it instead of just spending someone else's. I sat with that for a long moment, unsure what I owed the conversation, if anything. I appreciate you calling, I said finally. I don't think we're going back to what we were. I want to be honest about that. I don't think I'm asking for that, he said. I think I just wanted one person from that house to know I actually changed something, instead of just talking about it the way I used to talk about every business idea I never followed through on. We didn't talk long after that. I didn't offer him money, and he didn't ask for any, which was, on its own, a genuinely novel experience for both of us. I don't know if we'll ever have a real relationship again. I suspect we won't, not the kind that involves holidays or regular calls. But I've thought about that conversation more than almost any other from the entire ordeal, because it was the one moment where someone from that family demonstrated actual, sustained change rather than a performance of remorse, calibrated to get something out of me. I don't need it to lead anywhere. I'm simply glad, in a distant, complicated way, that it happened. I want to describe one more detail from that call, because it's the part I've turned over the most since. Near the end, almost as an afterthought, Rhett mentioned that he'd started fishing again, actual fishing, alone, at a reservoir near where he now lived, using an old rod he'd bought second-hand for $11. It's stupid, he said, but it's the first thing in years I've done just because I wanted to, not because it made me look like something to somebody. I keep thinking about the lake, our lake. I know I don't get to say our anymore, probably, but I think about it. I didn't have a response ready for that, and I let the silence sit for a moment, before simply saying that I hoped he was doing well. It was, I think, the truest thing I could offer him. Not forgiveness, not reconciliation, just the plain, unadorned hope that whatever he'd started building for himself, alone, with an $11 rod and no audience to perform for, might actually hold. I want to include one more thread I left out of the main account, because I only learned the full shape of it much later, and because it explains something about the original vote that I hadn't fully understood at the time. It was Idun, months afterward, who finally connected the pieces, mostly by accident. She'd run into an old college acquaintance, who now worked in commercial real estate financing, a small enough industry in our city that names traveled fast. And the acquaintance had mentioned, in passing, that Anders had spent the better part of that spring courting a group of investors for a boutique property development fund he was trying to launch. Investors who, as it happened, placed considerable weight on the appearance of old money, stable lineage, and what one of them had apparently described, in a meeting Idun's acquaintance had witnessed secondhand, as generational continuity. The reunion, it turned out, hadn't been Desmond's idea at all, not originally. Anders had proposed the blood-only framing to Desmond weeks before that Sunday dinner, explaining that his investors' families would be there, that they were old-fashioned in a specific, image-conscious way, and that an adopted brother-in-law with no bloodline connection to the Okafor Wren name might raise exactly the kind of quiet questions he couldn't afford his investors to be asking that week. Desmond, eager as ever to please anyone who might eventually be useful to him, had agreed without much resistance. Blythe, wanting her fiancé's business venture to succeed, and her own social position within it secured, had gone along without objection. Rhett, always more interested in being liked by whoever currently held the most status in the room, had simply followed the current. I sat with that information for a long time when Idun first told me, feeling something shift slightly in how I understood the whole ordeal. I had spent months assuming the vote was fundamentally about blood and belonging, about the family finally revealing some deep, long-held truth about how little I'd ever really counted. Learning that it had actually originated as a calculated business decision, that I'd been excluded not out of some profound rejection of my personhood, but simply because I was, in that specific moment, a minor inconvenience to somebody else's investor pitch, was, strangely, almost worse. It made the whole thing smaller. 21 years of trying to earn my way into that family, and in the end I'd been discarded not even out of genuine animus, just out of someone else's networking convenience, with the rest of the family too spineless or too self-interested to object. I brought this discovery to Osei, expecting him to help me process the fresh anger it produced. Instead, he asked a question I hadn't anticipated. "Does it actually change what you did in response?" "No," I admitted. "I'd have handled it exactly the same way either way." "Then I'd gently suggest," he said, "that the size of the reason doesn't actually need to determine the size of your response. You're allowed to respond fully to harm that was casually inflicted, not just harm that was deliberately, personally targeted. Most harm in families like yours isn't grand-scale animus. It's exactly this: convenience, cowardice, other people's priorities simply mattering more than yours, over and over, until the pattern becomes the whole relationship. I think you're actually describing something closer to the ordinary mechanism of neglect than some unusually dramatic betrayal. And I think that's worth sitting with, because it might help you stop looking for a villain elaborate enough to match how much it hurt, and start accepting that ordinary carelessness, repeated for 21 years, is entirely sufficient explanation on its own. I never confronted Anders directly about it. There didn't seem to be much point. His investment fund, as it happened, never fully launched. I heard, through the same channel, that 2 of his key investors pulled out after the public fallout from my email made its way, inevitably, into the same small circles Anders had been trying to court. Blythe and Anders's engagement dissolved roughly 10 months later, for reasons I never learned in detail, and didn't especially want to. I felt, hearing that, considerably less satisfaction than I might have expected. By that point, I'd mostly stopped keeping score. I want to include one final thread before closing this account, because it's the one piece of the aftermath that never resolved into anything as clean as the rest. And I think that lack of resolution is honest in a way the rest of the story isn't. About 2 years after that Sunday dinner, I received a letter. An actual paper letter, handwritten, forwarded to my office through Great Aunt Solveig, since I'd long since blocked every direct channel Priscilla might have used. I almost didn't read it. I sat with it unopened on my desk for the better part of a week before I finally did. It wasn't an apology. Not exactly, or not only. It was longer than that, more complicated. 4 full pages in Priscilla's careful, old-fashioned handwriting. She wrote about the early years, the ones I barely remembered. About how frightened she'd been taking in a grieving 11-year-old while newly pregnant with Rhett. About how she'd never quite known how to love 2 children who'd arrived into her life under such different circumstances. And how, somewhere along the way, not knowing how, had quietly calcified into not really trying. She wrote that she understood now, with the clarity that apparently only comes with genuinely losing everything, that comfort and cowardice had been indistinguishable to her for most of her life, and that she'd chosen the comfortable silence of not objecting to Desmond's treatment of me 1,000 small times, because objecting would have cost her something, and I never had. She did not ask me for anything. That was the detail that struck me most, reading it. After 21 years of every communication from that house arriving with some kind of attached request, this letter asked for nothing at all. It simply said, in its closing lines, that she didn't expect forgiveness, and wouldn't ask for contact, but wanted me to know that she understood, now fully and without excuse, exactly what she'd allowed to happen, under her own roof. I brought the letter to my next session with Osei, and we spent most of the hour on it, turning over what, if anything, I owed a response. "You don't owe her anything," Osei said. "That's worth saying plainly. But I'd ask you to consider whether responding, on your own terms, entirely for your own benefit rather than hers, might actually serve you. Not reconciliation, just closure, in your own words. So the last word on this relationship belongs to you, rather than to her letter." I thought about it for another 2 weeks before I wrote back. I kept it short, 4 sentences, nothing more. I told her I'd read the letter. I told her I believed she meant it. I told her that understanding what she'd allowed didn't undo what it had cost me, and that I wasn't interested in rebuilding a relationship, but that I appreciated her finally naming the truth of it without asking me to carry anything further on her behalf. I signed it with my name, not a signature that implied any ongoing closeness, just an acknowledgement that the letter had been received and read by the person it was addressed to. I want to describe the actual writing of that response, because it took me considerably longer than the finished 4 sentences would suggest. I drafted it first as a much longer letter, nearly 2 full pages, working through everything I'd never said to her directly: the $400, the fellowship deposit, the years of watching her choose silence over protection. I wrote all of it out, in full, late one night, and then read it back the next morning, and deleted almost all of it. Not because it wasn't true, every word of it was true, but because I recognized, rereading it, that I was writing it less for her benefit and more in the hope that finally articulating the full inventory of harm might produce some feeling of completion I hadn't yet found. It didn't, and I don't think it would have, no matter how thoroughly I catalogued it. The 4 sentences I eventually sent said everything that actually needed saying. Everything else was for me, and I found, in the end, that I didn't need to send it to feel it. I never heard from her again after that, and I think that was, in its own way, exactly right. Some relationships don't get a redemptive third act. Some of them simply get an honest last word, and then silence, and the silence itself is its own kind of mercy, for both people, in the end, though I only fully understood that much later. I want to add one final thought about that letter, because I think it clarifies something about the whole ordeal that I hadn't fully articulated even to myself until much later. Priscilla's letter was, in its way, the most honest communication I ever received from anyone in that house. More honest than Desmond's demand, more honest than Rhett's midnight apology, more honest even than the version of remorse he offered years later on the phone. It asked for nothing. It simply told the truth, and let the truth stand on its own, without attaching a request to it, without using the honesty as leverage for anything. I've thought since, that if she'd been capable of that kind of unconditional honesty 20 years earlier, when it might have actually changed something, our entire relationship might have looked different. She wasn't. She wasn't capable of it until she had nothing left to protect by withholding it. That's its own kind of tragedy, I think. Not a villain's tragedy, but the quieter, more common one, of a person who only becomes capable of decency once decency no longer costs them anything. I want to close with one final image, because I think it says more than any summary could. About a year after that Sunday dinner, I hosted my own gathering, nothing extravagant, just a rooftop barbecue with people who'd actually earned a place in my life. Idun and her husband Priyasha, Frantiska, a handful of engineers from Corvid who'd become genuine friends, rather than just colleagues, and Great Aunt Solveig, holding a glass of wine and laughing at something Idun had said, entirely at home among people who had nothing to do with the Okafor-Ren name at all. I want to describe that evening in a bit more detail, because it deserves more than a passing summary. It was, in its own quiet way, the actual counterweight to everything that came before it in this story. Percival, the junior engineer I'd taken under my wing, showed up with a bottle of wine he'd clearly researched carefully. Nervous in the specific way new employees are nervous at their boss's personal gathering, and I made a point of introducing him around myself, watching him slowly relax over the course of the evening, the same way I remembered relaxing, years earlier, at my first dinner with Idun's family, who had welcomed me, a virtual stranger, someone their daughter had simply mentioned once, as a promising business partner, with a warmth I hadn't known what to do with at the time. Wendell Farrow came too, a late addition to the guest list that surprised even me when I extended the invitation, and I watched him talk animatedly with Frantiska about, of all things, fly fishing. 2 people who would never have crossed paths, if not for the strange circuitous route that had brought them both into my life through entirely different doors. Osei had gently suggested, in one of our sessions, that I pay attention to moments like that one. Evidence, he said, that the family I was building wasn't simply a defensive replacement for the one I'd lost, but something with its own genuine, expanding logic, capable of absorbing new people for reasons that had nothing to do with what I'd survived. I stood at the railing for a moment, looking out over the city, and thought about the boy who'd arrived at that house with one duffel bag and a court order, who'd spent 21 years trying to earn a permanent place at a table that had never actually intended to keep him. I didn't feel anger anymore, standing there. I felt something closer to quiet astonishment at how much energy I'd spent, for so many years, trying to make myself indispensable to people who had already decided, long before I understood it, exactly how much of me they were willing to keep. I think, if I'm honest, that I still carry some version of that 11-year-old boy with me, even now, the one who arrived with a duffel bag and immediately understood, without being told in so many words, that his welcome was conditional, in ways the biological children's welcome never was. I don't think that particular ache fully disappears, no matter how much distance you put between yourself and its source. What changes, if you're fortunate, is what you do with it. I spent 2 decades trying to dissolve that ache by earning my way past it. I know now that it was never a problem I could earn my way out of, because it was never really about earning at all. It was about a household that had decided, long before I had any say in the matter, exactly how much of me it was willing to value, and no accomplishment, however large, was ever going to renegotiate that decision after the fact. What actually changed things wasn't the money, or the lien, or the bankruptcy, or even the demand letter that started the whole unraveling. What changed things was simpler and slower than any of that. I stopped waiting for that specific table to finally make room for me, and I built a different one instead, with different people, on entirely different terms. Terms where showing up wasn't a bid for approval, just an ordinary, unremarkable Tuesday among people who'd already decided, freely and without any spreadsheet attached, that I belonged there. I think sometimes about the version of me who sat frozen at that dining table, watching Rhett's mouth form the words, blood only, believing, in that instant, that the sentence was a verdict on my worth, rather than simply a verdict on that family's character. I wish I could tell him, if I could somehow reach back through the years to that exact moment, that the verdict said nothing true about him at all. It only ever described the limits of the people delivering it. I want to end, finally, with the thing I keep coming back to whenever anyone asks me how I found the strength to walk away from a family, however imperfect its claim on me, that I'd spent my whole life trying to belong to. I don't think it was strength, exactly. Not in the way people usually mean the word. It wasn't a single decisive act of courage. It was the slow, cumulative weight of 21 years of evidence, finally reaching a threshold I could no longer argue myself past. I didn't leave because I became brave. I left because I finally ran out of ways to convince myself that staying was love, rather than habit, and once that particular illusion cracked, there was simply nothing left holding the door shut. I sat on that rooftop, surrounded by people who'd chosen to be there, and understood, finally and completely, that I'd spent 21 years trying to buy a ticket onto a ship that was always going to sink. The moment I stopped paying, it sank, and I found out I'd built my own shoreline the entire time, without ever noticing.